Good morning. Welcome to our new series in our Adult Storytime program. Our series will be keeping with the theme for our summer reading program, Tales and Tales. Our book that we're reading from this month and probably throughout the summer is Fractured Fairy Tales as told by A.J. Jacobs, and it was featured on the TV show The Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle and Friends. What is a fractured fairy tale? A fractured fairy tale is one that has been modified in such a way that makes us laugh at an unexpected characterization, the plot development, or contrary point of view. It's a story that changes the characters, the setting, a point of view, or plots of fairy tales that we know. And today's story is entitled The Frog Prince. Many years ago, there was a year that was a mighty bad year for witches. They were everywhere. Big ones, little ones, ugly ones, and uglier ones. It got so bad you couldn't tell which witch was which. In fact, there were so many of them that there weren't enough people to go around to cast spells upon. It wasn't an uncommon sight to see witches fighting over who saw a person first, and whether he should be turned into a duck, put to sleep for 300 years, or given a third nostril. Then one day a little witch was walking through the forest looking for a victim, and aha! Suddenly she saw a little frog sitting on a log in the middle of a pond. My, what have we here?" said the witch. The frog thought to himself that this witch didn't have the highest IQ in the kingdom, but decided to humor her anyway. "We have a frog," he said. "What have we there?" "I'm a witch," said the witch. "See my tall black hat and my ugly nose warts? I'm your stereotypical witch." "Uh-huh," said the frog. "What do you want from me?" "I'm going to cast a spell on you." "A spell?" the frog chuckled. "Listen, lady, I'm already a frog. What else could you do to me?" But the witch was desperate. She hadn't cast a spell in 3 weeks. With a wave of her hand, zap! She changed the frog into a handsome young prince. "Hey, what's the big idea?" said the prince, formerly a frog. "I admit it's not the kind of spell we usually cast, but you know times are hard." She cackled and sauntered off. The prince was very depressed. He squatted down on the log he used to sit on as a frog. What did he want to be a prince for? He looked at his princely sword and princely cape and shook his head. He felt his face, not a bit of slime on it. He tried to catch a fly with his tongue, too short. He even tried to croak, but instead of ribbit, he said, "Rather a lovely day for a jousting tournament, aye?" Ugh! The only way for him to be happy was to find the witch and have her change him back into a frog. You know the old saying, you can take the frog out of the pond, but you can't take the pond out of the frog. The prince set off in search of the witch. After several hours of stumbling through the forest, he came upon a huge castle. Wouldn't you know it, but this particular castle was owned by a king who had a beautiful daughter, but unmarried. At that very moment, the king was asking his daughter why she hadn't taken a husband, even though she was of marrying age. "Why haven't you taken a husband, even though you are of marrying age?" said the king. "They're all frogs or something these days," said the princess. "This young man who just stumbled into our castle, he doesn't look like a frog." The king pointed at the prince, who had indeed just stumbled into the room. The princess looked at the prince and batted her eyes and said, "Are you a handsome young prince?" "No," replied the prince, "I'm a handsome young frog." "See," said the princess, throwing her hands up in the air. "No, the boy is just a little mixed up, that's all," said the king. "What he needs is a couple years with a strict Freudian or else a wife. Someone like, let's see, like you." So over the objections of the prince and the princess and the princess were married. And they were very happy. Well, actually, they weren't very happy. We're only halfway to the end, so it can't be a happy ending yet. Try it again. They were quite unhappy. The prince still insisted he was a frog. He even insisted on living on a log in the pond, which is not the lifestyle the princess was accustomed to. He insisted on fetching her flies, which was not her idea of fulfilling the marriage vows. The princess pestered him into living in a more princely, or at least human, manner, until he finally agreed to buy a beautiful cottage with a white picket fence. Then one day he was hopping about the yard when a witch, one of the many in the kingdom, passed by. "Oh, goody," she said to herself, "a handsome young prince. Probably the only one left in the kingdom, and he's mine, all mine." She raised her hands ready to cast a spell. "I think I'll change him into a frog," the prince suggested helpfully. "Good idea," said the witch. Zap! That night at the dinner table, the princess slurped her soup and looked over at her newly green, newly slimy, newly tiny husband. "You know, honey," she said, "you insist that you're a frog for so long, you're even beginning to look like one." "I keep telling you I am a frog," said the frog. The next day the frog was squatting in the front yard when who should walk by but the witch who had originally turned him into a prince. She was a bit upset. "Usually when I prince them, they stay princed," she mumbled to herself. She figured it was time to renew the spell, so zap! She tried to change him back into a handsome young prince. But being a bit rusty with her magic, she changed him into a chicken. A chicken! The Prince Frog chicken had had enough of this. With his wife, who was by now quite confused herself, he waddled down to the Witches' Union, Local 143, to put an end to this nonsense. There sat a gaggle of witches around the table complaining about the high price of newt's eyes and bat's ears. The former prince and frog stormed up to the table, looked at the head witch and said, "I've had enough of these hexes. I deserve a little common decency. Change me back to a prince," urged the princess. "Yes, a prince." The head witch agreed. She raised her hands and zap! She turned him not into a prince, but a primate. She tried again. Zap! A prune. Zap! Then a prison. Zap! Then a pint of pickles. You see, the frog had been so overly bewitched he couldn't be turned back into a prince. Finally, she returned him to a frog. The poor frog was very confused. He turned to his wife and said, "Will you still love me even though I'm a frog?" Well, she started scratching her head. Seeing her dilemma, the witch decided to put an end to her worries. With a quick wiggle of her fingers, the witch turned the princess into a frog. And with that, they both hopped back into the pond and sat on a mossy rock, where they exclaimed, "If we have to stay frogs for the rest of our lives, we'll just die." Now, I don't have to tell you that they didn't die, but every night they did croak. Thank you for joining us for our fractured fairy tale this morning, The Frog Prince. We hope you join us again for our next story, and I hope you look forward to see what's coming. Until we see you again, stay healthy, be safe, and have a good week.